Hi friends, my name is Viviana and today we're going to dive into the world of ecosystems. More specifically, we're going to be talking about a particular kind of ecosystem, and that's the intertidal zone. But before we start, we need to think about what an ecosystem might mean. So taking your pen and paper, I'd like you to draw what you think one might look like. And don't worry about getting it right or wrong, there's a bunch of right answers anyway. Okay friends, so once you're all done, go ahead and show the camera. If you take a look around, you might see a bunch of different drawings. And we have all these great drawings, but we still don't really know what an ecosystem is. So let's talk about it. An ecosystem is just a community of biotic and abiotic things that interact with each other. Biotic just describes something that is living or once was living. In my drawing, the biotic things would be the sponges, the coral, the kelp and seaweed, the fish, and the fish bone, because the fish bone was once living. Abiotic just describes something that is non-living. So in my drawing, that would be the sand, the rocks, the water, and the carbon dioxide in the bubbles. So an ecosystem is simply just a community of living and non-living things interacting with each other. And ecosystems can be as small as a pond or as big as the ocean. Other examples of ecosystems are the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, this flower garden here, and the salt marsh in Carpinteria. So now that we know what an ecosystem is, I want you to think back to your drawing and see if you included biotic and abiotic parts. Remember, that's living and non-living things. And think about how they might interact with each other. And next time you're out, try to observe this in an ecosystem. So now our friend James is going to help us, and we're going to learn about a specific type of ecosystem, and that's the intertidal zone.
Hey everyone. So what is an intertidal zone? Well, have you ever been to the beach? I'm sure you already know what it is or have an idea of what it might be. Tides are the rise and fall of ocean levels in the area where the water meets the land between a low tide and a high tide is the intertidal zone. What do we think causes the tides to rise and fall? It's actually the sun and moon that determine the level of the tides, and we can see that it changes with the orbit of the sun, moon, and earth. Every day there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides. Now there are a lot of different zones within the intertidal zone Jadyn's going to tell you all about.
So what exactly makes up the intertidal zone?
The intertidal zone is divided up into 4 sections. Each section depends on where in the zone it is and during what part of the tide it's underwater. Starting from the closest to the ocean and moving up towards land, these zones are the low intertidal zone, the mid intertidal zone, the high intertidal zone, and the splash or spray zone. Let's take a closer look at each of the zones and find out what kind of critters you might find lurking there.
Let's start with the furthest, most inland zone, the splash or spray zone. This zone is hardly ever put underwater by the tide. Only during very high tides or when the water level rises during a storm is this zone submerged. That's why it's called the spray zone. It is only really misted or splashed by incoming tides and is otherwise exposed to sunlight and air. Knowing that, do you think you would find a ton of living things in this zone? Try and think of some creatures that you might find. If you said there wouldn't be a ton of life in this zone, you would be correct. Since this zone is so often exposed to the dry conditions of air and sunlight, very few sea creatures or other species are well adapted to live here, because most would probably dry out without having access to water. However, some very specialized species have adapted to live in this zone to not dry out, and that way they can avoid some of the predators that might eat them in the lower zones. Some of the things you might see here would be these specialized snails that are adapted to live in these dry conditions.
Here are some limpets. They look like seashells attached to rocks, but they are actually a type of aquatic snail with a soft body underneath their shell. They attach to rocks like this by creating a super tight seal between the rock and their shell through suction. This protects them from drying out and from seabirds that might want to eat them.
Let's move on to the high intertidal zone. This zone is underwater during high tide peaks, or the highest points of the tide, but is otherwise exposed to air for the majority of the day. As for this zone, and for the rest of the zones as we move towards the ocean, water will rush over as the tide moves in and out, which may cause some organisms to be thrown around if they aren't well adapted to stay put. Knowing that this area might be exposed to a bit more water than the splash zone, what kinds of critters do you think might live here? And what adaptations do you think they might need to have? A few more species can be found in this zone. However, the ones that do still need to be pretty well adapted to not drying out. Some of the things you might find here would be barnacles, mussels, chitons, more species of snails, and probably some hermit crabs.
These large bunches of shells are actually groupings of mussels. Mussels attach to rocks using silky fibers that they make. This helps them survive the pounding of waves, and when they're exposed to air, these groupings prevent them from losing water and drying out. Being higher in the intertidal zone also protects these mussels from getting eaten by the sea stars you might find in the lower zones. These creepy looking things called chitons can also be found in this zone. These critters are called grazers, meaning they move along rocks and eat algae that they come across. In this video, you can also see some super tiny barnacles that attach to rocks using the super strong like glue substance that they make. And take a look at this hermit crab, found in a pool in the high intertidal zone that seems to be eating some algae off a mussel.
As we move further towards the ocean, we find the mid-intertidal zone. Here, the land is underwater twice a day during high tides and exposed to air twice a day during low tides. As the tide moves in and out, this area is constantly being hit and pulled by the waves. What kind of critters do you think you might find in this zone? Or what kind of adaptations do you think they need to have? Zone, we see quite a few more species start to appear, as well as some of the ones we've already seen in the higher zones. Some species you might see here would be more barnacles, snails, and mussels, as well as some new species of crab. In the lower end of the zone, you might even find some sea stars. Let's take a closer look.
Here's a kelp crab. Can you tell from their name what they might eat? Well, kelp. Despite their kind of menacing appearance, these crabs are actually vegetarians, or what we call in the nature world, herbivores. And they munch on the kelp and seaweeds that get washed up into this zone. Here's another crab called a rock crab that was found at Campus Point. This one is actually female, and you can see its eggs bunched up on its underside. Here's a cool sea snail also found at Campus Point. More different species of snails can be found in the mid-intertidal zone because they are less prone to drying out here, thanks to the tide coming in over this zone twice a day. In the lower end of the zone, you might even find some sea stars, which are actually carnivorous, meaning they eat other animals. These sea stars like to eat the mussels and barnacles that can be found in this zone.
Finally, we come to our zone closest to the ocean, the low intertidal zone. This zone is usually covered by water and is only exposed to air during really low tides. What kind of creatures do you think you might find here? And do you think there would be more or less different kinds of species in this zone compared to the higher zones? There are lots of different creatures that can be found in the low intertidal zone. Because this area is not as often exposed to the dry and harsh conditions of the air, lots of creatures who might dry out a bit easier can live here. Here you might see some sea anemones, some more types of sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and even an octopus if you're really lucky.
Here we have a sea anemone. Sea anemones can come in all kinds of colors, and like sea stars are carnivorous, and will eat sea snails, sea stars, and fish that are unlucky enough to get caught in their trap. These little tentacles surrounding these anemones will actually shock their prey to paralyze them and then curl inward to pull them into their mouth at the center. Humans aren't affected by this shock though, and by lightly tapping these tentacles you can watch the anemone close inward, thinking that it caught some food. You might also see some of these spiky sea urchins that are sometimes called the porcupines of the sea thanks to their spiky outside. These spikes are used to help the urchins stick to rocks, where they can eat algae they might find there. The spikes are also used like tons of little feet to get around. You can watch here as this urchin moves down into a pool. And check out this tiny little urchin that Malia found at Campus Point.
Altogether, these 4 zones and the creatures within them make up the intertidal zone.
So I'm sure a lot of you live close to somewhere where you can go and check out the intertidal zone for yourself. And we encourage you to do that. But we want to remind you that there are 2 really important things to remember. The first thing is to watch where you step and be super careful when you're walking because you want to make sure you don't step on any living creatures. The second thing you need to remember is never take anything away from the intertidal zone and don't move anything from one zone to a different zone. Also, do not leave your trash on the beach because it might get washed and get stuck in the intertidal zone. A creature could eat this piece of plastic, and if you ever see anything like this, pick it up and take it home and throw it away. There's so much natural beauty around us, and it's amazing that a lot
about the environment around us. And I just want to remind everyone that if you go exploring for yourself, make sure that you always treat the environment respectfully.